Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. Okay, Richard, so it's been a while since you and I have talked. We've been releasing episodes steadily, but that was mostly from a backlog of recordings. And so you and I probably feel a little bit rusty. We haven't had these sort of opportunities to engage in chit-chat for a while. But here we are, and it's nice to be doing this again. I'm in Hong Kong. I got up early at 5 a.m. and did a little bit of exercising and such to try to wake myself up. You are in Indiana, and so far as I can tell, you're, in a basement? It looks like a different sort of location. You've moved your recording studio.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm hiding out in the basement of my house in South Bend, Indiana. But we should note that this is our second time recording because all my 4 kids somehow found a way come down here.
Yeah,
and they just bombarded.
Yeah.
So we had to stop for a while. I mean, of course, now they know for sure that we are down here. And I'm hearing one of them now. I hope that I bet Lena, our magical engineer, will cut some of this stuff out and polish it.
I can't hear them. I have to say it was a joy for me. All 4 kids suddenly appeared and were running on the treadmill and grabbing the microphone and waving. And it was really delightful. And I know you get to see it all the time, and probably you can't help but see it a bit of as an interruption. But for your friends who don't get to see your kids so often, it's just so charming. Anyway, yes, so this is our second attempt to introduce the show. I guess we should say a little bit about the topic. It's moral examples in Confucianism. That is, how the Confucians, especially Confucius himself in the Analects, make use of moral examples as a kind of instructive method, maybe as a source of theory and as a way of teaching people and as a way of sort of inspiring people to become better, to engage in self-cultivation. That's a very quick description of the topic.
That's right. And that's the main topic. But I was curious about a question that is, of course, connected to this topic, which is, Justin, do you have any instances that you can recall where you knew someone or you met someone that you wanted to emulate in some way? You wanted to cultivate a certain trait that they had, or from a different direction, something we'll talk about much more in detail later. Did you meet someone where you thought, oh, wow, they possess some trait that you think is undesirable? So it forced you to reflect on your own self. And I was wondering if that's actually happened to you at some point in your own life.
A nice move there, Richard. Yeah, so what Richard has done is one of the passages that we're going to discuss today talks not just about good examples, finding people that you want to emulate, but also bad examples, using the vices, the bad behaviors of other people as a chance to reflect on whether you also share those vices and that bad behavior. Actually, yeah, I think it's easy to think of cases where some use of examples has at least nominally played a part in motivating me, where I've at least kind of committed intellectually to making good use of an example, good and bad. So I worry this is going to sound a little petty, but I have this observation about graduate school. And I wonder if it resonates with you, Richard. So when I was in graduate school, I was at the University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago is at the time that I was there, which was, I started in 1998, graduated in 2006. There were really good graduate students. The other PhD students were all pretty consistently fantastic. And it made us all a little insecure because most of us had been ambitious, driven students as undergrads, but felt somewhat special. And then we went to University of Chicago, and suddenly you're surrounded by even more ambitious and driven students. And that insecurity played out in all kinds of ways. I couldn't capture all of the ways in which insecurity plays out in the social dynamics of the graduate student cohorts. I was involved in a couple cohorts. But still, there were things I noticed about some of the graduate students who were a little more settled that I admired. And there were some things I noticed that I didn't admire. So I'm just going to sort of pick one issue and describe both what I admired and what I didn't admire, the sort of flip side, both sides of that issue. And that issue has to do with basically willingness to go outside one's own comfort zone. So one of the things that graduate students, back in the day at least, did that was quite impressive is it seemed like they knew everything about everything. It seems like they were so knowledgeable. There was no topic you could wander into that they hadn't read a book about and thought about very deeply and had some original view and take on. And that was quite impressive. But after a while, I started to realize that it was a bit of an illusion because these people who seemed to know everything about everything were very good at steering conversations in subtle ways to their favorite topics. So let's
Mhm.
say they were interested in semantics and pragmatism and theories of truth or something, then somehow every conversation, even if it's about some issue in public policy or applied ethics,
Yeah.
comes back to that, and so then they
Hmm.
can start talking their sort of
Hmm.
philosophy of language or semantic stuff. So I realized this was a very sort of clever thing to do, and it was a tempting thing to do myself. But I decided I should not emulate that. And instead, I should emulate the graduate students who had a kind of humility and natural curiosity such that they were willing to just admit that they didn't know anything about the topic and ask questions of others and find out. So, yeah, there's a kind of temperamental difference among graduate students that I became aware of pretty early on. And I decided, at least in principle, I wanted to emulate the people who showed more humility. I thought that the graduate students who were taking advantage of their opportunity, they're still young, they still have a lot to learn, to recognize their limits and to seek insight from others, were actually making better use of their education. And the other ones who were so impressive, but in a way that was essentially a thinly veiled illusion. They're impressive precisely because they were always steering the conversation. Those I thought were not to be emulated. So I feel like I've somewhat internalized that practice that I picked up from the more humble scholars.
Oh, I've experienced that. That's right. People have different orientations, and you do notice that some people want to kind of show off their knowledge. And I've
Yeah.
also known and had friends in graduate school that were genuinely curious. And what's interesting is that is the right spirit, at least. I mean, maybe some of those students were also insecure and they felt like, but if I talk about something I don't know about, then maybe I'll come off kind of foolish, which obviously can
Yes.
easily happen. So it does take a bit of courage. But I met people I admired greatly that had that kind of courage and kind of the humility that there are all kinds of things they don't know about. At this point, I'm 43 and now I've been doing philosophy for a long time, but there's so much that I don't know about. And I'm okay with that. And at varying levels of depth, I mean, some things I know a fair bit about. If
Yeah.
I'm not a
Yeah.
specialist in that specific topic, there are people who know way more about it than I do, but that's okay. I've
Yeah.
actually been thinking about, maybe we've talked about this before, but philosophy especially, there are these brilliant thinkers that have made a mark in history.
Mm.
And I've thought a long time about, so what do you do when you really don't think you have that kind of brilliance, which very few of us do? Why are we here? What are we doing? And I think the best way I've conceptualized the point and purpose of being just average, normal philosopher is, well, we're part of a tradition, we're part of a craft, and you teach and you try to write and you try to do the best you can, and you're sustaining the discipline, you're
Hmm.
continuing the tradition, and you'd hopefully contribute in a small, minute way. And that might just be through teaching some students why philosophy is wonderful, or writing a little paper that maybe a handful of people find illuminating. And then that's it. We're not all built to be David Hume or Aristotle or Aquinas or Mengzi. We're not going to
Yeah.
have that stature, and basically none of us will. So we see ourselves as part of the historical tradition, then I feel okay with what I'm doing, even though
Yeah.
I won't
Interesting.
make a mark.
Okay. Okay. So you find some comfort. That's a nice way of putting it. So it's in virtue of the fact that you are contributing to and belong to and are continuing historical tradition that you can accept a humbler role in
Yeah.
contributing to philosophy. Right. That's a nice point. Yeah. I like this. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Of course, I always thought, well, it's great if it's sort of noble in a way if you can see yourself as contributing in small ways and take some satisfaction from that. But I hadn't quite realized that there's a connection, say, to a historical tradition that makes that even more meaningful. Right. Maybe it's an obvious point, but I hadn't quite sunk in.
Yeah, that's why I was telling my undergrad students at their final reception, because they're about to graduate with a philosophy major. I tell
Yeah.
them, well, you've been initiated into a long standing historical tradition of philosophers,
Yeah.
and you're part of that history now.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, I have to say, I wonder though, since you are 8 years younger than me, I wonder if your experience in graduate school was somewhat different. I had this back when I was in graduate school, the discipline was shifting. It was shifting in the following way. The older generation of professional philosophers grew up at a time when professional philosophy was still understood basically as a kind of body of common knowledge. So when David Lewis published some path-breaking, cutting-edge paper on a topic, everyone read it, everyone had to form a view about it, and so it was a shared discussion point that everyone was somewhat knowledgeable of. And all the subdisciplines in philosophy, even if you didn't work in one of them, it was expected that you'd be current enough, that you'd be keeping up on those subdisciplines, so that if you had a guest who presented at your department in one of the other subdisciplines, you could still have things to say about their research. But by now, I'd say among professional philosophers, there's some acceptance of the fact that we're all specialists, and sometimes we interact with specialists who don't overlap with us at all. I mean, maybe we share a little bit of vocabulary and a little bit of methodology, a kind of broadly construed methodological commitments or something. But otherwise, we can't understand what's even interesting or important about each other's subdisciplines. Modal logic, a specialist in like ancient Greek philosophy and specialist in Neo-Confucianism and specialist in modal logic. What would they have to say to each other? I think people are more accepting of that now. But when I was in graduate school, they were not. The fact that I did Chinese philosophy was kind of threatening to some people, I have to say, because they didn't know anything about it. And moreover, they felt that they should, because there was still that residual ethical commitment to this idea that there was a kind of shared body of knowledge that all philosophers had to have, and then they had to be able to say useful things to one another. And so that thread, I think, explains some of the insecurity that I was experiencing. And I wonder if it's changed now that the discipline is more accepting of the fact that we have these silos and these highly specialized subfields.
Yeah, maybe it forced people to become humble because you realize, there's just no way you can know about all these different things. And there's a sense in which I relish in that kind of diversification. And then there's a part of me that thinks, it was nice, though, to have a common philosophical culture where you connect and talk about different topics. But philosophy is so broad now. And I guess every discipline's like this. I imagine physics is like this. Even mathematics, I'm sure there's narrow specializations. Maybe it's just kind of inevitable, but at least for when we teach our students, teach them in a way to broaden their minds, to have a general capacity, to be able to converse in a basic level in different areas of inquiry. It seems like that's an important part of a foundational education, especially one that's rooted in the humanities. You can't know about everything because that's not possible, obviously. But the foundation needs to be there. And of course, this is a different topic, but I've been thinking about the undergraduate education, especially maybe 3 or 4 months, because I've been teaching about what's the purpose of a university. I guess a topic that maybe we should discuss at length in some other episode.
I think we should, yeah. As it happens, my reading group here in Hong Kong, we have a reading group that's conducted ostensibly in modern Chinese, although we sometimes slip into English. And we read classical texts in Chinese philosophy. Right now we're reading the Xueji chapter of the Rites. The Xueji chapter is the sort of record of study, record of learning chapter. Actually, it was quite influential historically, although people don't seem to talk much about it these days. But it basically describes education, formal education, as it was conceived by the ancients. And that could give us a chance, if we want to discuss that topic, to also talk about the purpose of a university or of academic scholarship and study in the first place. Anyway, that's something we should discuss. But today we're going to discuss something else. We're going to discuss moral examples in the Analects. Should we give a quick preface to that one, I think?
So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about moral examples in the Analects, and we're going to discuss a few short but really important passages from the Analects, and they revolve around the concepts of learning, character, and self-cultivation. And one basic question we're going to consider is what makes learning actually take root in a person. So we'll be talking about these topics in part 2.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Yes. Okay. So we will discuss that after the break.
All right. So we are back, and we are going to now discuss several very important passages from the Analects. And again, our topic is moral examples in Confucianism. And so for our first passage, Justin, you're going to read it for us, right?
Yeah. So this is Analects 722, and I think of it as the 3 people walking together account, or when walking with 2 other people is one way of translating this opening line. As soon as I read it, many of you will recognize it, and it's probably one of the best known passages in the Analects. In fact, young children in school learn this passage in China. So here it is. The master said, "When walking with two other people, I will always find a teacher among them. I focus on those who are good and seek to emulate them, and focus on those who are bad in order to be reminded of what needs to be changed in myself." And that's the Edward Slingerland translation, and that's the entire passage. So just to emphasize again, Confucius on this interpretation is saying, well, if he's out walking with two other people, he's always going to find a teacher. This is a surprising statement, right? That even among just two other random people, he'll still find a teacher. Why? Well, in this special sense, that there will be some respect in which at least one of them is good, and thus it provides him with a kind of inspiring model to emulate. And there will be some other kind of flaw or vice or problem or shortcoming that not so much he should pity or look down upon, but he should use as an opportunity to look for the same sort of flaw, vice, or deficiency or shortcoming in himself. And so there's always a teacher everywhere he goes in that sense, in the sense that there's always something kind of worth emulating in someone else or worth kind of using as an instructive lesson for one's own personal self-reflection and correction. Okay, so yeah, I'll say this. I think this passage is interesting. In some ways, this is the featured passage of our whole discussion. This is the one we wanted to be really sure to discuss because it's fascinating in a number of respects. It seems to say something about the power of examples and the importance of examples, including examples that aren't necessarily idealized. He's not saying you just have to have some moral exemplar, some moral paragon, some sage in your life. You can find instructive examples even among ordinary people. It also says something about a certain kind of humility, right? It suggests that it's worth not just quickly assuming that deficiencies you see in other people are ones that you lack. You're supposed to use them as a reminder to look inward. In some ways, you discover your own flaws by kind of seeing them from the outside, as it were, seeing them in other people and thinking, oh, wait, do I have that same problem? So it's all very interesting. I wanted to make one quick point about how examples are sometimes understood as working. So I think that when we see Confucius recommend to people that they surround themselves with good examples and use good and bad examples as a kind of instructive method for discovering what sorts of virtues they want to strive to acquire, what sorts of vices they want to avoid, he has this idea which is well captured in a lot of recent scholarship on what's sometimes called exemplarism. That's the ism of exemplars, of having exemplars in your life. We can talk a little bit about what exemplarism is, perhaps, if we want. It's actually kind of a contested notion. But here's a really interesting phenomenon that I think both exemplarists in the 21st century talk about, people like Linda Zagzebski and Amy Olberding, and which I think it plays an important role in the Analects itself. It's referring to a phenomenon where you have a good example. You have an example of some good character trait or behavior, or a bad one perhaps. And then you also perhaps followed up with some account of what makes that person a good example or a bad example, right? But what's interesting about this particular phenomenon where you have a good or bad example and then you also try to explain why it's a good or bad example is often you have a greater amount of certainty, you have a greater degree of confidence in your belief that it's a good or bad example than you do in the reasons that make it good or bad, right? And so see if I can sort of make this point clear by analogy. I find that when people think music is really good, this often happens. So they first listen to some music and maybe they have to listen to it a few times. Maybe they don't love it on the first listen, but eventually they come to really love it. And they're much more sure that they loved music and that it's worth loving than they are about what makes it good, So what makes it so admirable. And sometimes they even need the help of a kind of music theorist or someone who can give them a very abstract account of what makes it good before they finally come around to seeing what it is that makes it good music. Like they just know they love it, right? And you could give them a justification and maybe in the end, it's not a very good justification. Maybe it's actually a reason not to love it. And they'd still be like, well, no, sorry, that must not be the right justification then because I'm quite sure it's great music. And so I think something similar happened to me when I was young. I grew up in Nebraska. And back then, most young people, especially young males, were really into cars. And I was not
Mm.
into cars at all. So I never quite understood the fascination with cars. And I remember there was this expression that other young people would use. They would say, that car drives well. And to me, that was an utterly mysterious claim. I was like, what does it mean, car drives well? It seems like a car just either drives or doesn't, right?
Hmm.
But then when I finally drove a good car that had power steering and the brakes and steering wheel were sort of responsive, but not too responsive, so that it was sort of somehow well integrated to my own natural inclinations for manipulating a car. Once I finally drove a car that drove well, I felt like I had a good example of driving well. And then I could go on to give an explanation of what it was for a car to drive well. So
Hmm.
the example leads the more theoretical account or the more abstract account of what makes it a good example. That's the sort of phenomenon that people who call themselves exemplarists, like Linda Zagzebski and Amy Olberding, are interested in. And I think it actually is doing a lot of work in the Analects too. The Analects seems to be providing us with illustrations of really interesting characters, Confucius especially, but others too. And by giving us certain little clues into the kind of narrative accounts of their lives, we come to see them as really good people. And then later on, we sort of reconstruct what it is that makes them good.
Mm. Yeah. So Zagzebski lists figures like Confucius, actually, and Jesus, Socrates as potential
Yeah.
moral exemplars. And then she says something like, we're more certain that they're admirable or that they're good than we are about claims about certain features, right? The good of pleasure and so on. And yeah, one thing that I do find interesting is, but I don't know. I was thinking, okay, so like take Socrates. So we admire him because he has this kind of deep desire for truth. And yeah, he doesn't care about material goods.
Yeah. Mhm.
But I remember thinking, like, oh, he was a little bit callous towards his wife, I thought,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
his kids. And so, but still, of course, I admire him on the whole. So I did wonder if, I don't know, the admiration is a bit more specific. I mean, even when we think of like Jesus, like we admire him, like, because he teaches to help someone who's or forgive your enemy, right? So we see a
Hmm.
kind of generosity of spirit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if the music case seems a little bit different to me because if I've never listened to a really amazing jazz music and then first time I hear it, I'm just floored by how great it is. I won't be able to articulate it probably.
Yeah.
That's right. But when it comes to the specific amazing heroes that I can think of, I think even from the beginning, I could say, well, yeah, like she was serving the downtrodden, or or fighting against injustice. I mean, it
Yeah.
just doesn't seem quite like. I can't think of an example where it'd be quite like the experience of the music.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, it just seems a little bit different than these other cases. So I'm not entirely sure if I quite agree with regard to the exemplarism.
Okay, interesting. So you're saying in my music case, when we respond to music and think, oh, this is really great, it may be that our brains aren't even tracking what makes the music great. We just happen
Yeah.
upon it. And then later on, we figure out what makes it great. Whereas in the case of kind of admiring someone for their ethical or moral model that they provide or something, our brains
Mhm.
are actually tracking what makes them great, sort of implicitly,
Yeah.
right? So there's kind of, in both cases, there's some ex post facto reconstruction, right? Like you admire the music, you admire the person, and then that happens very quickly through implicit or fast cognition, right? Automatically. But still, our brains are very good at tracking all kinds of things automatically through fast cognition, just like we do when we engage in facial recognition or kind of have intuitions about things. And so you're saying that kind of quick intuitive response is actually, in the case of moral admiration, still doing a lot of implicit work figuring out what's admirable about them. Yeah, okay, now that you put it that way, I'm not so sure that the music case is different, but anyway, I see your point.
Yeah, I think actually, maybe I was thinking about it slightly differently. So,
Hmm.
when it comes to the emotion of admiration, it seemed a bit more cognitively loaded, perhaps. Okay, I can imagine like I like someone, I find someone attractive or appealing in some sense in a way
Yeah,
that I can't quite fully articulate. Sometimes you just like I heard
yeah,
Bill Clinton when he would walk into the room, people would immediately
yeah.
just find him to be a glowing person because he was just so affable and there are people like that. Magic Johnson, I think, is kind of like that too. Actually, I don't know if people know
Uh-huh.
know much about him.
Oh,
But
basketball. Yeah.
yeah, great basketball. But he was just this illuminating personality. But admiration, maybe I'm thinking about a slightly different concept from like Zagzebski, maybe. But when I'm actually admiring, when I have that specific attitude, I think I
Yeah.
am much more able to identify, or there's a clearer sense of what I'm admiring about that person. If someone goes, "Oh, what do you think about him and
Yeah.
or her?" and I go, "Oh, I really admire her." And then if someone immediately followed up saying, "Oh, what about her that do you admire?" and I just don't. If I say, "I have no idea. I just feel this I don't know
Yeah.
if that would be the quite the emotion that I'm thinking of. I mean, again,
Yeah.
like I could just have a attraction that I don't really understand, but admiration, like a moral admiration, perhaps is maybe more specific. I
Yeah.
think I would pick out qualities quite immediately. Oh, well, she's serving the homeless, or
Yeah.
she's really courageous in speaking the truth. I mean, it'd just be weird to think. I got to think about it. I don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting way of accounting for this phenomenon where so Zagzebski makes this point. She thinks we in general are more certain that we admire Confucius, Jesus, Socrates, maybe the Buddha, than we are about what it is that makes them admirable. Assuming there's some sort of theory can account for the admirability of these figures, these paragons, we're more confident that we admire these people than we are about the theory. And I think what you're suggesting is that may just be because we're not very good at articulating our own unconscious minds or something, like,
Mhm.
so maybe the analogy there is like I don't know, the way we engage in implicit reasoning about grammar. If I say to a native speaker of English, the sentence, "Oh, I were going to the store yesterday." I
Mhm.
were going to the store yesterday. If they haven't studied any language in a kind of formal way, if they haven't studied formal grammar, they wouldn't be able to explain what's wrong with that sentence, but they'd be quite sure that it's wrong.
Right.
And they might grasp at various justifications.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they're not actually tracking rules of grammar. They are. That's what's really impressive about being a native level speaker of a language. You
Yeah.
track all kinds of implicit grammatical rules. And so you're
Yeah.
saying our moral admiration is like that. It's like we actually are tracking the features that make someone morally admirable. It's just that we're not very good at articulating what those features are. So if you ask me to say what's great about Confucius, Jesus, Socrates, and the Buddha, I might say something like, oh, service to others and devotion to commitment to helping people and being kind and so on. And then you
Mhm.
point out, well, that's true, I guess, but notice that Socrates was pretty neglectful of his family, his wife
Yeah.
and children didn't seem that worried about his sons when he was going to be executed. And you can say, and Buddha, by the way, left his family. At that point, I'd be forced to revise a little bit. I maybe say, oh, yeah, right, that's true. So their service, their
Mhm.
devotion to others, to their immediate family seems to be quite weak. And maybe that's a problem. But I'd still say, but there's something I admire about them. Maybe haven't successfully put my finger on it, but there's something that I do find admirable. So
Mm.
yeah, anyway, I take your point. It's a good point. And by the way, I should mention, basically given Richard a chance to elaborate on this really good review he wrote of Zagzebski's book, which we should put in the show notes. You really admire her book, but you bring out
Mhm.
some
Yes.
reservations. Yeah.
Yeah. No, no, it's a great book and it's a really interesting idea. And there's no doubt that exemplarism or the role of moral exemplars is really important for Confucianism. And I think for generally, for most of us, like, I think we learn from people that we admire, these models we have. But yeah, I'm still thinking about this, to be honest. I think it's a really interesting question what exactly admiration is and yeah, the role it plays. But yeah,
Yeah.
this passage though that you just read earlier, Justin, Analects 722 is, I think, just wonderful. And there's kind of a difference here too between like emulating a model and also Confucius points out how also when you meet someone bad, you should be reminded of what needs to be changed, right? And which is a
Yeah.
little bit different from emulation. It has to do with something like, well, I'm not even sure what word to use. It's an interesting phenomenon because emulation, I think we all understand, like, we want to become someone like the person we admire. But when we see someone that's bad, you can kind of look into yourself and ask, wait, do I have some of those qualities too that I should try to uproot? But I
Yeah.
don't even know. It doesn't seem like there's like a clear word for that, which I find interesting in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the opposite of emulation. So emulation is finding someone admirable or someone you want to be like, and thus being motivated to emulate them, to model
Right.
yourself on them. The opposite is when you find something bad in a person and thus are motivated by some kind of aversion not to be that way. For me, I feel like, didn't we recently discuss The Office, that show that was popular in the
Yeah,
early
yeah,
2000s?
yeah,
I myself found Michael Scott, the figure of the kind of boss who thought he was a really great boss, but
yeah.
it was really lacking in self-awareness and didn't realize how transparent he was and kind of narcissistic he was. I find him to be a good example of the sort of thing that Confucius has in mind when he says, focus on those who are bad in others, maybe in order to be reminded of what needs to be changed in myself. So you're meant to laugh at Michael Scott. You realize, oh yeah, he thinks he's really awesome, but in fact, there are ways in which he's lazy and he's inconsiderate and so on. And precisely because you sort of have some contempt for that kind of boss, all of us have had that kind of boss at some point in our lives, I think. And maybe because you find it laughable, that then motivates you to make sure that you're not also,
Mm.
behaving in the same way. You don't want to be laughable. You don't want to be kind of contemptible in the same way that he is. Yeah, you're
Although,
right.
Justin, I think that takes a second step, though. That seems like it's partly because you are more self
Mm,
aware. Because I think people can easily just not make that second step. They can just be like, oh, that's such a bad trait to have. But then you also then have to kind of make that
yeah,
second step of that Confucius is kind of advocating, which is, well, do you have that quality too? Or like you need to look into yourself and go, wait, do I? Am I a little bit like that? And that
yeah.
part, everyone has that kind of introspective
No,
process
no.
going. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was really interested in this for a while in the kind of social psychology and moral psychology of this particular phenomenon, recognizing your own faults. So
Mm.
arguably, there's a way of reading the psychological literature, at least as it was summed up in Jonathan Haidt's book, Happiness Hypothesis, which is admittedly a little dated now.
Mm.
But there's a way of reading the psychological literature that he cites there to suggest that in the work of self-improvement, the hardest thing to do essentially is accept that yourself are flawed, that you have some inadequacy or some shortcoming, which of course is the first step to correcting it. So we have these very powerful self-serving cognitive biases that make it very hard to see our own flaws. And Confucius, no doubt, is aware of that. One thing that really
Mm.
comes through in the Analects is that he himself sees himself as flawed. A lot of later interpreters are kind of troubled by this, these passages that seem to suggest that.
Hmm.
And thus he thinks he has work to do. And he
Right.
really considers it a kind of great achievement to recognize your own flaws. And so one thing that's being suggested in 722, the passage we just read, is that you can do that in part by externalizing those flaws, that it's a little easier to see when they're in someone
Mm.
else.
Hmm.
And then you can kind of reflect back on whether you yourself have it,
Hmm.
superimposing the other person's flaws on yourself, as it were. I think that's right. It's an indirect way of going about the business of recognizing your own flaws, but it's in some ways more effective.
Yes. No, I think it's very important, actually. Yeah, really, it can teach you quite a bit. In fact, well, I mean, I have so many kind of personal examples, but actually, I shouldn't relate them now. But yeah, it does seem like an incredibly important way of moral learning to really force yourself to think about those qualities that you just really dislike in other people and to be
Yeah.
honest about your own self because oftentimes you really could have those same qualities maybe not to that extent although maybe you do but flaws that other people have are flaws that you yourself can easily have and are blind
Yeah.
to so
Yeah.
yeah I really I think Confucius is saying something extremely profound in identifying not just a moral emulation but this potential for learning from even those the bad people or people making these kinds of errors.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You could just say as a statistical claim, you see the same flaws in people again and again. I've noticed that when you're sort of completely dependent upon someone, they're your boss or your teacher, being in school, I remember being at the mercy of my teachers in this sense, because they had this power of giving me good or bad grades. When someone has that kind of power, those flaws are particularly acute. You're keenly aware of those flaws as the person who's dependent on them. And then, of course, many of us then go in reverse positions. And now I'm the teacher, right? And I'm not very often a boss, but occasionally I've been a boss. And given that I've seen these flaws again and again in so many bosses and teachers in the past, it
Yes.
seems like statistically odds are pretty good that I have them too. So, yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. Like it's good to remember when you were a student. I have to
yeah,
sometimes remind myself, sometimes when I get a little bit annoyed at some of my students because they're like showing up late for class or missing
yeah,
class. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, I remember skipping some classes or being late to some classes or maybe not communicating properly in the right kind of deferential way towards my teachers. And so I have to
Yeah.
kind of remind myself, yeah, first of all, they're like 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids, or, and you were one too. And so I think that's extremely
Yeah.
important to kind of bring to bear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Another really interesting point that's made by this passage has to do with what I want to call the ubiquity of teachers. And I'm sorry to
Hmm.
use that fancy word. Maybe I should explain yeah, so ubiquity is just the quality of being present everywhere.
Hmm.
If something is ubiquitous, then it's present everywhere. And so what's interesting about this claim is he's saying no matter where you go, so long as you have at least two other people with you, even when you're just out for a walk with two others, you will find a teacher. That's a surprising point, but the Confucian commentators make a lot of it. So it's tempting to think of the Confucian tradition in the following way. There was this great sage figure, and this great sage figure taught this other person, and this other person taught this other person. And they were all exemplars, and they passed down the knowledge of how to be good people. But that's actually not the correct reading according to most readings of the Analects. The correct reading says that Confucius was very good at piecing together a kind of picture of being a well-rounded person or a complete person or a person of complete virtue from various examples. There's another passage, it's 1922. It's also, so we just read 722. The other passage is 1922, where someone asks of one of Confucius's students, how did he acquire his learning? And the student, who I think is Zigong, says something like, well, actually, he just pieced it together. He didn't have any one teacher that was a sage that he learned from.
Hmm.
But there are people who, he says, have the way of kings Wen and Wu, these great sage kings, within
Hmm.
them. And so he didn't have a constant teacher. He just kind of pieced together his insights from what was good in this person and what was good in this other person and so on.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a kind of also a social aspect here that he's highlighting, which is
Yeah.
moral learning happens within a social context that we learn from others because it's so hard to just kind of navel gaze and just learn everything through introspection alone. It shows that
Yes.
oftentimes we
Right.
need to kind of like reflect on other people's behaviors, whether good or bad. And that is an integral part of how we come to learn what's good or bad, right or wrong.
Yes. Right. Good. So that's another really important point. It's a social endeavor. It's almost sort of unavoidably social. There's no such thing as just figuring out how to be a good person entirely on your own. And the other point we've been discussing is the way in which teachers in some loose sense are ubiquitous. No matter where you go, you can find a teacher. Both of those points are going to come up in the other passages that we planned to discuss today. We have two more. The next one, it also addresses this ubiquity point, the point that there seems to be people with admirable character traits worth emulating no matter where you go. And that's 528.
Yes, I think I will be reading this passage. This is from Analects 5:28. It says, "The master said, in any village of 10 households, there are surely those who are as dutiful or trustworthy as I am, but there is no one who matches my love for learning." This is a great, yeah, very condensed passage, but also it's a little surprising. He's saying there are other people that will be as dutiful and trustworthy as the master, Confucius himself. And
Yes.
so it's a very kind of a humble, like a real statement of humility. Although he
Yeah.
does say that, at least for love of learning, no one else will quite have it to his extent. Yeah, I'm
Yes.
sure you've read a lot of commentary on this, Justin. I wonder what other
Yeah.
commentators have said about this.
Yes, actually, there's a lot of discussion of it for such a short and simple passage. I think because people are intrigued with it for precisely the reason you suggest. So he's really saying, like, you can go to some tiny little hut village of just huts or something.
Hmm.
I think you're
Hmm.
supposed to be thinking of a relatively rural community, so that where presumably no one has any access to education. And he says, even there, you'll find people who are dutiful and trustworthy. That's a translation of zhong and xing, by the way, two very important virtues that are often paired together. Zhong, which is being translated here as dutiful, sometimes translated as loyalty, sometimes translated as conscientiousness. Anyway, yeah, the point is you'll find people who really probably strike you as admirably dutiful and admirably trustworthy. You feel like you can deeply count on them. They're very reliable. even though they don't have a love of learning. And Confucius basically thinks the only difference between him and them is that he loves learning. Yeah, it is a remarkable statement. Yeah, so I did read a lot of commentary. One thing that came up that was interesting to me is there's in the Li Ji, the record of the rites, this kind of important book on ritual that many Confucians see as a classic. In one of the chapters that's basically about etiquette, there's this remark that when someone enters on a chariot, when they're riding a chariot with a horse and leading the way, and they enter even a small village, they're supposed to grab the front crossbar as a sign of respect. So the crossbar is very far forward on the chariot. So by grabbing it, they kind of lower themselves a little bit. So it's sort of like bowing. And it's a very short instruction in this kind of chapter on etiquette. But some of the commentators link that rule of etiquette in ancient times to this passage. They're saying, well, Confucius said that even in small villages, there are people who are zhongxing, who are dutiful and trustworthy. So that means that everywhere you go, even to these small rural villages where people have no formal education, there are people that are worth revering and respecting. That's why this rule exists. It's because these people are everywhere. So I think that's, you shouldn't just assume they're kind of crude ruffians, I guess, you know?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. But I guess, yeah. So now, what is exactly this love for learning, which seems so important? So, learning here is the Chinese character shui, and it appears in the very beginning of the Analects, as I recall, 1-1,
Yeah.
where, yeah, it's one of the joys, right? The
Yeah.
learning and practicing what you have learned is one of the great joys.
Yep.
And, yeah. And it seems like it plays a pivotal role throughout the whole Confucian tradition, even the later Confucians think of shui or learning as so central. And I think it's good to kind of think about what exactly that is for the Confucians. Obviously, there's a kind of moral or virtue aspect to learning. It's not the kind of scientific learning that we might think, or some of us might think nowadays.
Yeah, right. There's a lot. It's really interesting because the passage suggests that Confucius, in some ways, is humble, but in other ways distinguishes himself from ordinary people. So he's humble in the sense that he thinks, apparently, just anywhere you go, there will be people who have these virtues of dutifulness and trustworthiness. But he also seems to think that love of learning makes this a real difference between him and them. And so then the question is, what is that love of learning really? And how much of a difference does it make? So yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that. Let's start with that first question. How much of a difference does it make? I don't think there's any one answer. So looking at the commentary, there are some people who think it makes not much difference. So the Northern Song, very influential commentator named Xingbing, seems to read this passage as suggesting that Confucius sees himself as just a little bit better than other people. In important ways, perhaps, but he shouldn't take too much pride in it. Like there's a great deal of sort of not inborn, but through natural processes, people can acquire a great deal of these virtues of dutifulness and reliability or trustworthiness. There's another passage, Analects 1:6, where Confucius basically says a young person who's striving to become a better person should basically just observe all these good behaviors, being respectful to your elders, being trustworthy, and so on. And then if there's any energy left over at the end of the day, after you've done all these other kind of observed all these courtesies really and these social protocols, you can devote that to learning cultural arts. But that's just what's to be done with your excess energy and your excess time. Like the primary work is just living daily life. Primarily work of becoming a good person is just living daily life. That's Analects 1:6. And you can read that as sort of into this particular passage as suggesting, that it wouldn't be surprising that there are people with no formal education who are still very good people who have these very important virtues. So that's one view from this Northern Song commentator, Xingbing, that suggests that Confucius doesn't see a profound difference between himself and others. But I think probably the consensus view among commentators in the historical Confucian tradition is that Confucius really was head and shoulders better than these people in the villages, and very substantially so. And that the love of learning makes all the difference. So the question is, what difference does it make? Why does it make such a big difference? And here there's a lot of theories. One that I noticed that comes up quite often among late imperial Confucians, including my favorite guy, Dai Zhen, is that there's some way in which you can attribute devotion and trustworthiness to someone's heart-mind, to their xing. The Chinese character xing is often translated as heart-mind. And you can safely say, yes, this person's heart is fully devoted, fully loyal, fully trustworthy and reliable. This person in their heart has all those qualities. And yet, because of deficiencies of knowledge, it will still manifest in behavioral problems, such that they're not exactly practicing the Confucian way. In other words, there's this kind of point that people are in the late imperial tradition tend to be interested in, that the way in which virtuous behaviors aren't fully accounted for or fully reducible to the attitudes of the heart alone. That you need
Mm.
some kind of knowledge, you need knowledge of a tradition in order to be fully in compliance with the Confucian way. So, and to sort of manifest in a behavioral sense these virtues without making mistakes or errors. And so there's no sort of abstracts. I thought maybe we could give an example. Honesty, maybe there's a
Mhm.
sense in which a person that we've come across in one of these villages is fully honest, is like really admirably honest in the sense that they have honest attitudes. They really don't mean to deceive. They're always telling the truth as they see it and so on. But without learning, there will still be ways in which their honesty slips up and leads to
Mhm.
errors. Maybe they're honest to a fault, right? So they
Mhm.
don't realize
Right.
when they should be telling white lies,
Right.
and they're being rude to people.
Right.
Or their
Right.
honesty, which they think is really just a matter of not hiding facts from others or not hiding what they're really thinking, comes across as, I don't know, arrogance or dismissiveness, looking down on people
Mhm.
or something.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of refinement and additional work that learning is supposed to add.
Mhm.
Having trustworthy attitudes, whatever those are, and dutiful attitudes is not enough. Learning adds something above and beyond those qualities.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Now, it does say, though, in this passage, the love of learning. So, okay, everything you said is extremely plausible, and that's probably how I would have read this passage. But when it comes to the love of learning, I was wondering if, I don't know, this is probably just overreading on my part, but I usually teach the allegory of the cave like most teachers when they teach intro to philosophy. And I don't know if you remember, Justin, but at one point Plato does talk about the nature of education in the allegory
Oh,
of the cave. And he says everyone thinks it wrongly. That's what Plato says. Everyone thinks it's just filling minds with knowledge. But he says that's actually not what
yeah,
education, properly speaking, is. Education, properly speaking, is the reorientation of the soul toward the good. So it's like the turning of the soul. And
right.
students, they don't really fully grasp it because it just sounds so strange. Because, wait, that's education? Like, why would just turning your gaze be
Yeah,
the nature of education? And I always thought, actually, there's something really important about this, which is if you're not directed toward what's most important or towards what's good and worthwhile, then
yeah,
you're not, even if you have other good qualities, you will just not be heading in the right direction. But whereas if you're even lacking some talent or maybe not as good as someone else, at least if you're like gazing in the right direction, then you can at least move toward the right
yeah,
goals and make progress. And so I was wondering if there was this thought that, but the love of learning is so fundamental. In fact, in Confucius' spiritual autobiography, was that the first stage when he was 15 that he
yes. Well, he
that
set
he
his mind
st-
on learning. Yeah,
right. So that's actually the very first step. In fact, I think I brought in Plato's
oh,
beliefs
maybe.
about learning
Yeah,
there. And so I'm probably playing on that. But right, that's the first step that he took at age 15, as I recall. And
yeah,
so it's like the first most fundamental thing you got to get right, which is you have to love to learn. And at
yeah,
least you're on your way.
yeah. That's a good point. So there's a really important sense in which the most important thing you're supposed to get from education is independent of the contents of what you learn, but just the love of learning itself. And it's very hard to describe what it is about the love of learning that is added over and above the sort of benefits of the love of learning, the contents. But there's something very important there. The Confucian commentaries, especially sort of inspired by the Chung brothers, the kind of founders of Neo-Confucianism who inspired Zhu Xi so much, they love to talk about how the love of learning adds substance to what one studies. So they use this word shi, xing de shi is for people who know modern Chinese. Yeah, just the best translation of it is substance. And it's a very kind of difficult concept to explain in English, but the idea is that in some sense, when you're learning the Confucian way, if you lack the love of learning, what you're learning really is for you something like an empty formality. It lacks substance. Somehow the love itself, having the right attitude toward your learning, makes it more substantive than it otherwise would be. So, yeah, and I do see a connection. I remember that line from the allegory of the cave in Plato. It's really important, yeah, the people in the cave who are basically watching shadows, illusions, and
Right.
not yet learning real stuff, develop a kind of interest or a sort of actual affection for or desire to learn real stuff and not just spend all their time talking about illusions. And yeah, there's something similar going on here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this love of learning is supposed to be much more transformative. And sure, yeah, this idea that it adds substance. Maybe the thought is these other folks who are trustworthy and dutiful, maybe they could just be doing it out of pressure, right? Or cultural kind of tide, or just kind of mimicking sometimes behaviors. I guess it's not entirely clear to what extent they're deeply dutiful or
Yeah.
anchored
Yeah.
in a true appreciation of duty. Because there are people, I think, who are able to just kind of follow orders well and just kind of mimic behavior as well. And
Yeah.
but it's not anchored in or grounded in a way that won't just kind of let the dutifulness kind of dissipate or other conditions. Because the virtues are supposed to be real qualities that are able to
Yeah.
withstand pressure, I think. And so I wonder if the love of learning is supposed to help anchor these other, what are good qualities that you should have.
Yeah, exactly. I was not expecting us to go this direction, Richard, but it's quite interesting that we're reaching for the same language, whether we're talking about the love of learning in Plato or the love of learning in Confucianism. And that language has to do with something like being real, being substantive, and not
Hmm.
just formal.
Hmm.
And it's, yeah, they're very hard to explain why exactly, but there's this sort of shared consensus view really across the traditions that somehow you get that quality of being real and substantive through not just by learning stuff, but by loving what you learn and loving the process of learning.
Yeah, maybe you're just trustworthy because you're just afraid of being caught or getting reprimanded.
Yeah,
You have to think of truthfulness as good for its own sake. Or else, if you're just doing it for
yeah,
extrinsic reasons, then you don't really have the genuine trustworthiness.
yeah. Good for its own sake, or that's right. Yeah. Good for your sake as a person who wants to be a trustworthy person. Yeah, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, so that's another passage on our theme, which is the use of examples in Confucianism. I think we liked that passage in part because it illustrated how you could find good examples everywhere, but perhaps how there are differences in the value of those examples. Confucius seems to be suggesting that there is something really trustworthy and devotional in people that you find in ordinary life, even people without a lot of formal education. We have one other passage that also talks about how you can use people who provide good examples in your own life, and this has to do with making friends, among other things. And this is passage 1:8 in the Analects. And I guess I'm going to read that one. The master said, "If a gentleman is not serious, he will not inspire awe. What he learns will be grasped only superficially." Another way of translating that phrase is what he learns will not be solid, will not be firm. And that's Ni Peiming's translation. He translates the key term gu as solid. I'll keep reading. Let your actions be governed by dutifulness and trustworthiness. Again, those two virtues that we mentioned just a bit ago that you can find even in small villages, right? Dutifulness and trustworthiness. And do not accept as a friend one who is not your equal. If you have committed a transgression, do not be afraid to change your ways. So, yeah, just to kind of sum up, the passage begins by saying a gentleman should be serious, otherwise he won't inspire awe, and you'll only have a kind of superficial or not very firm grasp of what you learn. He says, let your actions be governed by dutifulness and trustworthiness. And then there's this very interesting claim about friendship. Do not accept as a friend one who is not your equal, who's basically not as good as you, is what it says in Chinese. Someone who's not as good as you. That, by the way, is apparently a kind of running theme in Confucius's advice. There's another passage that comes very close to this one that says something very similar about making friends. I think it's Analects 9:25. So it's not just in this passage that he makes this very interesting claim that you should find friends who are your equals or who are as good as you. And then he concludes, okay, and if you commit a transgression or if you make a mistake or an error, don't be afraid to change your ways. So once again, be that person who's willing to recognize your own faults and fix them.
Hmm. So there is this paradox here, Justin, that I think you pointed out at one point, which is that you should not accept as a friend who is not your equal. But then what's odd is that means someone who's, I guess, morally better than you should not accept you as a friend. And
Yeah,
that there's
right.
something kind of strange about that. But I
Yeah.
guess, yeah, maybe it's not strictly speaking a paradox, but that is a little bit strange, I suppose, that you shouldn't expect someone who's better than you to accept you as a friend.
Yeah.
Okay, you definitely shouldn't take on someone who's not as good as you as a friend, but only someone as equal. But surely you should want someone who's better than you to be your friend because then you can emulate them. And in fact, that seems like a good thing to do. But then, according to this principle, well, no, they actually should not befriend you, which is, yeah,
Yeah.
there is something odd about that.
Yeah, you're right. It's not strictly speaking a paradox because there's one way out, which is everyone can just befriend someone who's exactly their equal, right? So, Richard, you're a better person than me. I guess that means you can't befriend
Oh,
me,
I'm not, yeah.
right? Because I can befriend you because you're better than me, but you can't befriend me. It only
Right.
works if we're both exactly, I guess this is impossible, but somehow
Yeah.
exactly the same in goodness.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not a paradox, but it's a difficulty. It's kind of like almost a logistical difficulty that's hard to think your way out of. And for what it's worth, the commentators are aware of it. So there's some discussion of this issue.
Oh.
Actually, when I first read this passage, I remember I first read it. I took 2 courses on the 4 books that I just read with a kind of mentor who was usually a teacher or graduate student in Taiwan. And I remember that teacher said, well, we don't have to read it too strictly. The idea is kind of rough parody, like so long as you and I are in the same ballpark, so to speak. I'm not like a total moral reprobate and
Yeah.
and you're not a saint, so long as we're like in the kind of big fuzzy gray area that's roughly comparable, it's okay. That's one solution. Another solution is just to say something like, well, it's really about how committed you are to being a good person. After all, there are actually a number of passages in the Analects that suggest finding good friends, finding the right kind of friends, is really about finding people who are like-minded in the sense that they share commitments. They share commitments to being
Mhm.
better people, to understanding the Confucian way, and so on. So in that case, one way of reading that passage, someone who's not as good as you, is just to say good as you insofar as they're committed to learning the Confucian way. Not that they actually have the virtues yet, but you're both sort of good at loving the Confucian way and being devoted to learning it.
Yeah. So of course I often have to bring up Aristotle at some point or else I'm just,
Yes.
my day's not fulfilled.
Yeah.
But famously, Aristotle talks about friendship quite a bit, actually, in his ethics. And he talks about 3 different kinds of friendships, right? One is a kind of friendship based on benefit or utility. Another is a friendship based on pleasure. And finally,
Yeah.
the third one is friendship based on virtue. And actually, one of the things that I learned from reading different commentators is that it's not that Aristotle is saying those other types of non virtue based friendships are not really friendships or good. I think
Yeah.
he acknowledges them to be real friendships and they are good,
Yes.
although not as good as the virtue based ones. And these are real friendships. These are like, you can imagine, I don't know, your colleague at the workplace. Maybe it's not virtue
Yeah.
based friendship, but maybe you enjoy a little bit of laughter. Maybe it's kind of like the office. Those are real friendships too. And you do care about the person for their own sake. You do have to have that. But yeah, you're not quite equally good. But I guess, like, yes, I don't know. Like, it just does seem like friendship is a very complex topic and just
Yeah.
seems like there's a variety of different types of friendships. It does strike me as true.
Okay, you're right. So that also helps mitigate the problem that it seems like you just have running around finding people who are your equals, moral equals. And it mitigates it by saying, well, they're friendships in different senses. We can borrow from Aristotle here and say, there are these other friendships that aren't really about your shared commitment to virtue. And those are fine. And maybe Confucius is making the same move here. He says, when he talks about friends here, he means friends in a very special sense, right? And by the
Mm.
way, yes, you're right. No day would be complete without you mentioning Aristotle. Just for those who don't follow our show on the Chinese platforms, Lena, our wonderful producer and audio engineer, has a kind of running joke she makes in the comments. She refers to it as Richard's Aristotle daka. And daka is the Chinese term for card punching. So it's sort of like you've punched into work insofar as you've mentioned Aristotle. In a day, you've like, it works better in Chinese because that word daka is used much more broadly it can refer to like taking pictures that you post on Instagram or Redbook. But anyway, yeah, the point is it somehow completes the day for you, Richard. So I'm glad you managed to punch the card. That's right. That's another way of mitigating it. I think what's interesting about the passage is it's in some ways an eclectic series of statements. It says, if a gentleman is not serious, he will not inspire awe. Okay, that's one statement. Then it goes on to say, what he learns will be grasped only superficially. That's another statement. So now he's talking about the importance of being serious, inspiring awe, having some kind of stable learning, solid learning that's not superficial and too flexible or transitory. Those seem like interesting points. But then he goes on to say, let your actions be governed by dutifulness and trustworthiness. And then he makes the statement about friendship, right? And then he makes a statement about changing your ways if you commit a transgression or if you make a mistake. That just seems like a weird collection of thoughts that are sort of non sequiturs, right? There's no obvious inferential connection between them. But one way of reading the passage as a unified whole is essentially see it as all about making sure that you keep the right company. So all those sort of random assortments of thoughts could be really about the important work of surrounding yourself with like-minded people. So if the gentleman is not serious, he will not inspire awe. That's about making sure that you are not a kind of flippant person who's treating everything trivially and flippantly, like you don't take it seriously. And if you do that, then people will be in awe of you and they'll sort of take you seriously and they'll attract the right people, you know? And then he says, well, if you don't do that, then what you learn won't be firm, won't be held solidly. I think what he's suggesting there maybe is that if you surround yourself with the wrong kinds of people who don't take learning the Confucian way seriously or becoming better people seriously, then you won't have that kind of social reinforcement for what you learn. So let's say you are inspired, as I am, by Confucius's total indifference to class, to sort of economic class, right? He says he'll take any student so long as they can provide him with a kind of token symbolic gift as tuition. He says, you shouldn't judge someone just because he wears shabby clothes. He could be a person of character, so on and so forth. That's really admirable. But let's say you're surrounded by people who just their self-esteem is wrapped up in being wealthier than others. And so you hang out with all these kind of wealthy people who can't help but sneer at those who are poor and so on. That kind of the peer pressure and the influence of peers is so profound, especially for someone who doesn't have a really strong sense of self. I think back to your youth, that it's going to be hard for any of the lessons that you learn from your study of the Confucian way to stick, right? So that then sort of leads us to that key line, the one that we find so challenging about finding friends who are at least your equals. That's the reason why it's important to find friends who are your equals, because then you'll have the right company.
Yeah, that's a great reading. Yeah, that I think does make the passage quite coherent and threads a needle through each part. Because, yeah, I did have this difficulty with this passage. And again, I guess one way we can take it is kind of committed toward the way. Like, it doesn't mean necessarily completely morally equal in standing or having every moral quality be exactly equal. Because that's, not going to be right. Yeah. But at least if you have a shared end, like you're both trying to live a virtuous life. And then it's not as, there I think is quite a bit more plausible. And then the further idea is that will have all kinds of consequences because we're social creatures. We learn from others, as the other passages noted in different ways. So I like that reading a lot.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting passage. Okay, well, so unfortunately, the plumbers are knocking at the door. There's a pipe gushing water in the kitchen. And you know how it is. You only have so much control over your schedule. So reluctantly, I think we'll have to wrap it up here. I love these passages. I've really enjoyed talking about them with you, Richard. It's always amazing how we often move in surprising directions once we actually start the conversation.
Yes.
But I guess because I have to move on to the next thing, I'll just say that was it. So that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.